So the question is about how do you harmonize studies that use different measurements, specifically drinking measurements, or could be any behavior, right? Sure. So any outcome measurement, how do you harmonize studies that use different times, different measurements, different 18 item versus 21 item, all of these different measurements.
This doesn't work.
Try this one.
Okay. According to the latest opinion piece for depression, there are 280 measures developed in the past century alone that developed and used. So I think it's a very common problem. We have had this difficulty of harmonizing. Sometimes we can harmonize and analyze and pin people exactly on the same axis. But some other times, we simply have to say it's really not feasible. If that's the case, we have to use two-step analysis instead of single-step analysis like David did, so we can combine it data meaningfully nonetheless, and it's one way of harmonizing by design.
Other questions? Down the front? So the question is about how do you frame a meta-analysis so that it's useful for implementation? Is that right?
I'm looking to support a more permanent implementation by using it as proof, but I don't know how to say the data says this, so we should do that.
So using meta-analysis as evidence to help with dissemination and implementation. Right, it's using it as a sales point. Yeah.
So I think that there's quite a bit of articles, and I'd be happy to talk with you more about this in terms of ways that you can take that information to sell the value of research synthesis. So I think if we think about it as a field, as we're moving away from null hypothesis significance testing, as we think about false positives that can happen even in the most well-designed trial, I think that's where the value of research synthesis and meta-analysis in particular comes in, because it can give you a broader spectrum of the entire evidence rather than relying on the findings from a single study where you've got idiosyncratic study sample characteristics that might be producing different effects. So I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. I think that there are ways that you can use these meta-analytic results to make those claims. And then really, I think in terms of making your particular point for consistent or long-term implementation, that's where I think the value of having stakeholders involved in those conversations to think about, for your particular study, for instance, talking about here are the findings that you have found in your particular context, right? And so I think that is a recurring theme in this meeting is that context matters. And so you can take those meta-analytic findings from the current field, but then use that to situate it within your local context. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I'd be happy to talk with you after and give you some resources that might help you make that claim for your audience.
Question? Yes, please. So the question is, what have we learned that are going to help us to be able to critically evaluate what we see in meta-analysis now? Okay.
Okay. Okay, I guess I will go first. As a consumer of meta-analysis studies, I think we need to look at the findings very carefully rather than like accepting it as a fact. Look at it more closely. And I guess if it is done well, we can trust their treatment effect size in general. So other people have already studied whether treatment effect size would be about roughly equivalent, whether you use AD only versus IPD only. And the verdict is it matches up quite closely enough. So it's a matter of whether done it right or not done it right. But as for the mechanisms or subgroups or model-based estimates, it requires more than an AD.
And maybe let me add that I very much appreciate organizations like Cochrane and others that churn these out, but I think the drawback is sometimes they're done by people who are not experts in the field, and they're making decisions about how to think about what the intervention was, what the outcome was, and they don't really, they don't know how to chunk things. So that is maybe one limitation of reading, that people have made a lot of prior decisions about how to frame this thing, and they may not have any background in that area.
Yeah, and I agree entirely with that, is thinking about who was on the team, the review team, and so making sure that you do have those multiple stakeholders involved. I would also say, as I touched on in my presentation, and again, I come from sort of the Cochrane-Campbell aggregate data meta-analysis world. That's how I've been trained. But I think as consumers of those more traditional aggregate data meta-analyses, I really do think this is a critical point about being wary about any of those conclusions about variability at the patient level. And again, we often are interested in how these effects might vary by age, race, gender, ethnicity, baseline severity, psychiatric comorbidity. And so you will see a lot of aggregate data meta-analyses examining those characteristics, those patient characteristics at that aggregate level to see how it's correlated with average effects. But again, you have to just be very wary in terms of drawing any firm conclusions from those kinds of analyses because of this issue of the ecological fallacy risk.
Was there a question over? Yes, please. So the question was about what are the risks of combining a bunch of small data sets into one large data set? In terms of power, right?
Should I go for it?
Sure.
Well, there is a way to capture study-to-study variation using the, the random effects meta-analysis model. So it will be accounted in some ways. And also having large data sets at the study level means, I guess, you can also rank order them and study what makes them more effective than others. So you can actually specifically go into the source of the effect size differences at the participant level. So I do not necessarily think that is a drawback of having large studies, but I think it's a tremendous opportunity, except that you have to deal with some challenges of harmonizing and making sure the interpretation is the same.
And
just a quick point to add. I think thinking from a clinical point of view, it's always helpful to, even just at the level of writing up the results, is in a meta-analysis, you're typically reporting this forest plot with odds ratios or like Cohen's d. I think that question about maybe we're overpowering, well, if that effect size is quite small, I think, for example, Dr. Tanner Smith, when she was sort of giving the example of the results from her studies, even translating that into, well, in a typical week, those in the control condition drank on average of this number of days versus those in intervention. So I think translating those results into something that even someone, your grandmother reading the newspaper or over dinner could understand, I think that helps put even quote unquote overpowered studies in context. And just as kind of a context, though, there will be cases where there's a lot of data and it's important to attend to power there. In the general meta-analysis literature, I think sort of generally for many of us will be finding meta-analyses that are much smaller. So probably over 2/3 of studies in the Cochrane review are 5 studies or around 5 studies. So that's actually quite common as well.
And Mariellen, do you want to have the last question? And so it was just a comment about considering a STTR to develop a data toolbox or data science tool. Yeah, thank you. So thank you again to an excellent panel, and thank you all for coming. Safe travels.